There's a moment when the sun disappears, when darkness falls and you're left with just your fears. That's the moment you feel your first pang of doubt. That's the moment when the night comes out.
Hello, everybody. This is Brian Alaspa, and I'm the guy who writes the stories here that you listen to on When the Night Comes Out, the podcast. I just wanted to take a moment to introduce this one called Sacrament. This one is a special short story for me. Last year, 2021, December, I lost my mom after a relatively brief illness, and I dealt with it with this story, and it started as a nightmare I had. And you know you're a horror author when you wake up after having a nightmare and say, you know, with a little work, that could make a pretty good story. And the result was this very strange, very bizarre, and kind of terrifying tale. So I do hope you enjoy it. And remember, this is a very personal story for me. So again, thank you for listening, and thank you for supporting the podcast. And now I'll turn it back over to Allie James for the latest episode of When the Night Comes Out, the podcast, and Sacrament.
When the Night Comes Out presents Sacrament. The very first rituals man probably created were those surrounding death. Nothing has caused humans to be more curious and more afraid than the unknowable of what happens after we die. Some of those rituals, those traditions, continue until this day. Because there are things that happen when we die we dare not think about, except during the darkest of hours, when the night comes out. The men were all around me, talking, telling me the things I needed to know, probably saying the right things one is supposed to say at moments like this, but I was not listening. Not at all. Instead, there was a rushing sound in my head, like a river swollen after a heavy rain. Is this what going crazy sounds like? I thought to myself. I am so sorry for your loss, said Phil, the town councilman and the erstwhile leader of the island community. Do you need any help with the preparations? I shook my head, but my neck felt filled with rusty hardware, worn hinges. What was I shaking my head about? What did he just ask me? Oh, yes, the preparation. The shudder ran down my entire body violently. Oh, shit. The sacrament. I don't know if I can. I muttered to myself. You have to, son. He replied. I know it seems hard, but it's for the best. For you and for the rest of us. I nodded, and he seemed satisfied, but inside I screamed. It was bad enough watching my mother deteriorate in front of my eyes. I had to watch her go from the vibrant, smart woman who raised me into this being that was constantly afraid, always confused. Each day, more of her was carved away. As if that weren't torture enough, now came the sacrament. Jesus. It was near noon before they all left. One by one, the men and women who had shown up to comfort me or pay respects to my mom shook my hand, extended a platitude, and walked out. Then I was alone. I didn't want to do this. On this island, traditions and the sacrament ran deep. It was ancient. Everyone knew about it. It was how we disposed of our dead. I stood in the living room, trying to think how I was going to do this, when there was a knock at the door. I nearly jumped out of my skin. My door had an opaque window allowing one to see shapes but not details. I could see someone standing there of medium height and slender build. When I opened the door, it shocked me to see my brother. "Daniel," I exclaimed. "Hello, brother," he said, raising his eyebrow and smiling. "You didn't really think I'd just miss this, did you?" Actually, I truly did. He had fled the island ages ago, found a big business career, and jet set all over the world. He and both my parents had been at odds for much of his life, so the moment an offer came which would take him away, he took it. "We may have had our problems, but she's my mother. I wouldn't let you go through this alone either." He seemed to read my mind. I let him inside, and we hugged for a long time in the doorway. Then he asked if he could see Mom, so I took him to the bedroom where she lay. So frail. How a disease that destroyed the mind could also so viciously whittle away the person, I could not fathom. I watched as he stared down at her. She had a little bit of a sheet over her body, just up to her neck. There was a hospital gown on her too, but not much else. I heard him mutter to her sadly. Then he put his hand on her forehead before leaning down and kissing the same. "Okay, big brother," he said at last. "I know what needs to happen. I guess we'd best get started." No one knew when the sacrament started. It was just always there. Perhaps it had started when the first men set foot on the island. It was a lush place where crops and farm animals thrived. While so much of this part of the world got slammed with rough weather, on the island it always seemed warmer, perhaps less rainy. It was said the sacrament was what allowed that to happen. While that may have been superstition, no one wanted to be the one to risk it. On the surface, it seemed simple. When someone died on the island, friends or loved ones were to cover the corpse with an odd kind of oil, wrap the body tightly in a sheet, then lay it outside, face up. During the night, something would come, and by morning the body would be gone. Something. What, you might reasonably ask? No one knew for sure, because no one was allowed to see. During the 24 hours the corpse was to lay out, no one was to leave their homes. No one had ever seen what came. No one who had ever lived to tell about it. I grabbed the small bottle one of the townspeople had given to me. Was it a woman? Gladys? Or had it been Dale? I couldn't remember. It had only been a couple of hours ago. Funny how the mind works. I opened the stopper, and the most foul odor emerged. Even my brother winced. I tipped a bit onto my index finger. I marveled at how small the bottle was. Ancient. How old was the glass? I took the oil, or whatever it was, and made a small X on my mom's forehead, then another at the base of her throat, another at first her right, then left elbow, 2 more on both feet. "Is that it?" Daniel asked, his voice odd and muffled because he held his nose. "It should be," I whispered, my eyes closed, and I felt the hot sting of tears against my eyelids. Now we just have to wrap her up. There were legends, of course. Legends mixed with the sacrament itself, and so entwined it was nearly impossible to separate them. It was said about 8 years ago, an old man named Christopher laid his young daughter on the lawn. This was a daughter he had doted upon and loved more than they thought it possible a man like Christopher was purported to be capable of. He was devastated and not taking the idea of the sacrament very well at all. Although he had been told not to deviate from the rituals surrounding the process, he spent the day being angry, having to be restrained. When his daughter was laid out on the lawn, they said you could hear him wailing, saying her name repeatedly. The story goes they sedated him for hours until it was near night. It's that time when the thing comes, or things. Whatever comes and takes the body away, or eats it, or absorbs it. No one knows for sure. They boarded up their house for the night, and those who were supposed to be watching Christopher fell asleep. So when he woke up upon hearing something outside his window, they didn't know what was going on until it was too late. They said he opened the front door and faced the thing or things. No one knows for certain, but it was said the next morning they found the corpse of the daughter gone, but also Christopher and the rest of his family. However, there was so much blood splattered all over the house it appeared to have been painted. The carpet was soaked. Bits of flesh were stuck to the walls. We got the sheet wrapped around her body. Then we used thin rope to tie it by tightening around the ankles, knees, waist, and her neck. We now had a body-shaped white sheet on the bed. "This is the part I'm really dreading," Daniel said. I was too, to be honest, but the corpse was surprisingly light. Outside, the sun shone down in some bizarre scenario that looked like the opposite of things inside the house. We did not feel sunny. There was nothing joyous to celebrate this day. I took the head, while Daniel handled her legs and feet. He walked backwards down the hall, staunchly looking down instead of where he was going, some form of muscle memory kicking in to allow him not to trip. I thought of the days when my brother and both of my parents would shout at each other. He had spent another night out too late, perhaps running all over town with friends they said were hoodlums. The local police might bring him home, his pockets filled with stolen items from homes or the stores he and his gang had broken into. So much between them all. Then there were the times he and my father argued. When Dad died, it was my mom and a neighbor who went through with the sacrament. I had actually left the island at the time. Things were bad between my father and all of us. I couldn't bear to be there. Perhaps that made me a terrible son. Probably. But I came back. I thought Mom might thrive, start a new life. But it was soon obvious things were wrong. When I came back, the house was full of notes to remind her of everything. Notes written, then rewritten. She began forgetting things, then talking about how people were following her. We got the front door open and eased her out. The sun was like an active creature attacking us. Both of us were sweating before we made it to the lawn. "Where do we put her?" asked Daniel. "Right here, by the tree." We set her down gently near the tree she had planted 15 years ago. She loved this tree. I stared at it instead of her, feeling that it looked sad now. "What now?" "You know what happens. Don't you remember from when we were kids?" Daniel shrugged and wiped his eyes. "I think I've tried so hard to forget." I looked up into the bright blue sky. Not a cloud. Still so warm despite the time of year, too. Just endless blue and not even a bird. We go inside, lock the doors, stay in there until tomorrow morning. There's plenty of food. We sure won't go hungry. The lights flicker. I remember that. Yes, they do. Daniel took his turn scanning the sky. "This is insane. This is just crazy." "It's the sacrament. It's what we do." "Yeah, I know." There was not much else to say. Daniel walked past me and into the house. I studied the skies again. It was said whatever came flew down from the sky. People always said they heard wings whenever it arrived. Large wings. Sometimes they said there were odd guttural and growling sounds from outside. Inside the house, the lights would flicker but never go out. No one knew what happened to the bodies. Some claimed this creature devoured them. Some said the creature was death itself, or a minion of death, that it just carried the bodies away somewhere. Others claimed it swallowed the deceased's soul. Why did it take all night? Was this creature the same that had always been there? Why did it not want to be seen? No one knew. Of course, I had always been curious. Who wouldn't be? The fear of it was absolute and crushing against the chest. The desire to know what would happen was almost overwhelming. Daniel and I sat in the kitchen, barely eating the food we had piled up on our plates. We both kept checking the time and what little light kept coming through the edges of the blinds and curtains across the windows. Waiting is... Daniel just shrugged. There was nothing else to say. Yeah. Do you wonder what it is? Daniel sighed. Of course. Look, this is a thing that only happens here as far as I know. Why here? I've always wondered. Just once I wanted someone to look and see what it is. Mom was so strict about all this, remember? Dad would try to bend the rules and not lock up, but she'd yell at him. Dad was never a traditionalist. I laughed and took a bite of bread. Have you ever wondered what really happened? I think you once had this plan to sneak out one day to see. Do you remember? Yeah, when I was 10. I was going to crawl out of an upstairs window and sneak over to the house a few blocks away. Can't remember the family's name anymore, but I thought I'd sneak over there and hide a few blocks away and see what was happening with Dad's binoculars. How far did you get in your plan? Daniel laughed. Mom caught me sneaking the binoculars. Man, she screamed at me, gave me a crack across the face. Yeah, a crack across the face was always Mom and Dad's preferred way of punishing us. The light over the sink flickered. It was quick, but the light buzzed and flashed. Oh shit. When you looked at the town's records, going back hundreds of years, there was always mention of the sacrament. There's even a depiction on a stained glass window in the church. The religious beliefs in the town were always just a little skewed. There was the traditional church doctrine with Jesus and his mates, but there was something else, too. No one had a name for the entity. Even with all the text written about the sacrament, they did not give the entity a name. They did not even describe it. Think about it, because I did for a long time. If there was a deal made with this entity or whatever produced the entity, then it must have shown itself. So what was with the rule of killing anyone who saw the entity? There were times I wished I could go back in time to that moment. What did the entity look like? And why did the founder who wrote this all down not describe what it was? Whatever the reason, it didn't happen. Just like so much in religion, there was always just enough there to give it some credence, but enormous gaps that allowed your imagination to fill in the blanks. Which left fear. Always fear. The overall fear which permeated the island made life hard, and something Daniel and I resented. The lights flashed again, and a smell of electrical ozone filled my nose. Daniel wrinkled his nose too. Is it here? Daniel whispered. I don't... The sound which came from the front of the house caught the words in my throat. Wings. Large, leathery wings. It's hard to describe, but the noise was obviously wings. However, if you've ever heard a bird take off, you know the sound. This was different. And we're just supposed to sit here all night? Daniel asked. Yeah. Daniel turned and looked at the front of the house, just down the hallway where the front window was. I could see his entire body was tense. Outside, there was silence. I felt something inside me, a weird tingling sensation. My mother was out there, and something was happening to her body, but I did not know what. The pull toward the door, to head to the front window and throw open the curtain to just see what was there, was like a physical hand inside me. Can you feel it too? I asked, my mouth barely moving. I felt so small, so insignificant. The pull? Yes. I studied my brother's face. There was something alive, vibrating, and agitated behind his eyes. Something which put me off. It was only then I realized his being here did not make sense to me. He and my parents had no love lost between them. Why was he here now? "Why did you come back here, Daniel?" I asked. "I wanted to be with you for this. Bullshit. Why are you here?" Daniel's gaze finally slowly shifted from the food in front of him to my eyes. There were tears in those eyes, but he swallowed hard, keeping them at bay. "You came here to see it, didn't you? To finish the job you started all those years ago?" Daniel nodded, and then, to my dismay, he got up from the stool and headed toward the living room. "What are you doing?" "I just want to get closer. I want to be close to her when this thing does whatever it's going to do." He would not stop, and he crept his way down the hallway. I could see from how he walked that he was trying to be quiet. He was sort of heel-toeing his way there. When he reached the living room, he vanished from my sight, but I heard him opening one of the zippers to his suitcase. I heard him remove something from within. Then he sat down on the small sofa facing the front window. I knew this because the moment he stepped out of the kitchen, I stood up and watched him. Then, before I even realized what I was doing, I was walking down the hallway too. As I got closer to the living room, I could hear something coming from the lawn. I didn't want to admit it, but it was a weird sucking sound. It was like listening to someone slurping loudly through a straw. My stomach turned. I also felt anger rise within me. What was this thing doing to my mother's body? As I walked, the more unfair all of this became. What kind of entity does this to a group of people? If it was true that doing this allowed the entity or entities to bring about nice weather and fortune to this island, then they had some kind of power. Why did they need the bodies of the dead then? Were they not powerful enough? What kind of deal was this to offer the humans who landed on this rock? What humans would agree to it? Nothing about it made sense, and I was angry this was happening. What did this leave the rest of us? No body? No coffin? No ashes? What did we have but the ritual and the sacrament? I reached the living room and sat down across from my brother. I saw then he had a large knife, almost a machete, in his hand. He stared down at the floor. "How the hell did you get that here?" I asked. "I bought it once I landed. You know they never check the bags when you get on the ferry." "What do you think you're going to do, brother?" I asked. "Nothing about this is fair, brother, nothing. How can you be so calm? Of course, you were always the one to follow the rules, right? The one who followed whatever Mom and Dad said?" "Hey, I don't think that's fair. I left for a while too. We all had our problems." This didn't seem to satisfy him, and he gripped the knife tighter. He looked ready to spring into action. "I've come to believe the stories." I admitted it out loud for the first time. "I think the story of Christopher and his family is true. There are things in this world we cannot explain, and some of them are horrifying." He raised his head and locked eyes with me. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I've spent years looking into strange phenomena all around the world. There was a recording made years ago, taken right here on this island. The world thinks it's a photoshopped thing, but I think it's real. Someone sneaked out and caught a blue-skinned creature with wide eyes and a long tongue and red hair. Huge bat-like wings. The thing had its tongue buried through the sheet into the dead body and was drinking. Drinking until the creature suddenly sensed it was being watched, turned its horrific wide-eyed face toward the person taking the footage and launched at him." "What is it?" he asked, his own eyes wide. "A fairy? A demon? The angel of death?" "I don't know, brother, but I know I don't want to see it full on." "If this video exists, why haven't I seen it? Why the hell didn't something like that go viral?" I sighed. "Because the best thing to do was ignore here on the island. The rest of the world just assumed they faked it. People here take this seriously. You know that. They don't want to look. They don't want to know. Our mother is out there being consumed. He looked horrified at the thought. I was horrified too, but I knew this was what had to be. Consumed like food, brother. It's just a body. Whatever our mother was, she's long gone. I rubbed the palms of my hands on my knees. The entire world seemed oddly tilted on its axis. Nothing seemed real. I could still hear it behind me, slurping away, draining her. What does it do with the bodies when it's done? He asked. The video doesn't show. I don't know, maybe it flies away with it? This is madness. This has to stop. Why doesn't someone stop it? And stop what, brother? Stop the good this sacrament brings? I held up both hands in supplication. Daniel's eyes darted around, searching my face as if lost at sea and trying to find a place to land. I don't understand you. How can you be like this? Are you curious? And what are we left with? Not even the bloody sheet we wrapped her in. I wiped away a tear from my right eye. It's better this way. We don't have to bury her. We don't have to spread the ashes. We're left with the memories and can choose the ones which we remember the most favorably. You're being insane. I shook my head. This is what has to happen. It's taken me until now, all this time, to realize this has to happen. Daniel jumped to his feet and walked past me on the sofa, approaching the curtains. The sound from the lawn was never-ending. Slurp, slurp. What are you doing? I asked. Hey, Daniel, just sit down here. Talk to me. He seemed not to hear me at all. All I could hear were the sounds. I was frozen as he reached out toward the curtain, and with just his fingertips, he pulled the curtain back just a tiny bit. He recoiled in horror. Dear God. I stood and meant to grab him before he did anything more, but instead, I caught the briefest of glances outside the window. It was horrifying. Large wings which arched high into the air and were dark, dark blue, indigo. I saw a hunched body covered with indigo scales. It was a kind of blue that was almost painful to look at. Then, just as the curtain was about to drop back, I saw bright red hair which hung down over the indigo shoulders. A female, or at the very least, something that resembled a female. The creature was hunched over my mother's corpse. The sounds came from there for sure, but the glimpse was too quick for me to see much else. I suddenly had the image of a giant mosquito with a proboscis penetrating the sheet and the body beneath, slowly sucking out the blood and whatever liquids were inside. No embalming. That was part of the rules. Just the weird potion on the body and the sheet, then put the deceased on the lawn, like you were tossing out garbage. Daniel shuddered. I felt his entire body tense up. I gripped one hand on his shoulder, and my other hand grabbed his wrist. At the same time, my own resolve was vanishing. Although the curtain had fallen back, I could not unsee what I saw. This was madness. I thought of the day spent watching her disappear in front of my eyes. I had stood there alone, and now here was Daniel, ready to cause problems. But my belief in the necessity of this ritual was fading. I thought about how frustrating and terrifying it must have been for my mother to deal with this all on her own with my father. I hadn't been here, but she had done all of this. She probably sat on the very same sofa where we had just moments ago. Our father, who had left us with debt and little else, making a life after him for our mother nearly impossible. She had raised us. She had cared for us no matter what we did, and this was how it all ended for her? No, Daniel said. Daniel twisted in my hands and got loose. He walked toward the door. I moved fast, got in front of him, and tried to bar the way. Don't do this, brother, please. I've already lost Mom and Dad and don't want to lose you now. Get out of my way, brother. I stayed where I was, and to my surprise, he swung the machete at me. I stepped back instinctively, and it mostly missed, but the edge caught me just enough to tear my shirt and create a line of bright red blood. I nearly fell over. Out the window, I could hear the creature stop slurping its meal. It let out a twisted, horrid sound that must have been its version of screaming. Then suddenly, almost instantaneously, it was outside the door. I could see its shadow through the frosted glass. "Stop, Daniel!" I cried out, but he was already past me and headed for the door. There should be no more, I thought. No more of this madness, and yet the fear filled me. Daniel reached for the door and heard the creature outside growl in a way no human should hear. "No more," he said, the blade ready. He turned the doorknob. It can be hard to look a demon in the face. Sometimes it can even be fatal. It is also very difficult to follow traditions, especially when dealing with someone you loved. Sometimes, though, those rituals, that sacrament, is there for your own protection. This is especially true when the sun fades, the stars emerge, when the night comes out. This is the final episode of Season 3 of When the Night Comes Out. For Allie James to narrate your book, movie, or help with your audio production, look her up online or contact us through the show page. Visit Amazon.com for Brian Alaspa's 60-plus books, novels, and stories. Don't worry, we'll be back in 2023 with Season 4, and may have some special episodes to tide you over between now and then. Until then, be well, and remember to hold the hand of the one closest to you when the sun goes down and when the night comes out.